Right now, one of my favorite senators in the Maryland General Assembly will come up and speak. And let me tell you why he's my favorite senator, not just because he represents the 22nd. He does a great job in that. But he's fair. He's very inclusive. He looks out for the little guy. He makes wonderful recommendations. How do I know that? He recommended me for the House of Delegates. I wasn't 100% sure, but he was persistent, and he convinced me. And I think he was right, because I love what I do. And I thank you all for allowing me to do it. And we'll now hear one of the wisest men I know in the Senate, Paul Pinsky.
Well, you know as well as I do that Tawanna Gaines was very deserving and has done a great job up here, as have the other delegates. So let's hear it for them. You know, when we decided to invite David Harrington to be the keynote speaker tonight, I should have known that when he spoke, I'd be crossing off things in my speech. You know, David and I think we thought alike a lot for many, many years, and I think that was my mistake. I should have kept him off the agenda because he went through about half of the comments I was going to make, although I'm still going to make them just in a different voice. But thank you, David, for your comments. Absolutely appreciated and right on target. We've also been joined by a few other people before I start. Delegate Jolene Ivey, Delegate Barbara Frush, from 47 and 21 respectively, and Delegate Ivey is the chairwoman of the House delegation, so thank you. Oh, and Senator Victor Ramirez, also from the 47th District. Thank you, Victor, as well. Let me also thank a few people before I start on some of my remarks. My staff, Ian Ullman, Kim Taylor, you've met both of them. They do a great job. The staff of the delegates and our interns who are here this session, they're terrific. Of course, let me acknowledge my wife Joan and my mother-in-law Dorothy, who are here tonight. Thank you both. And as always, my good friend Mario Rapoli from Three Brothers, who is our I'm not sure when you made Mario the caterer for life, but it's fine with me because he and Michael too, thank you. They do a great job. And they're what local, small and medium-sized business people should be about, caring about the community and doing right by the community, so thank you. You know, today, the inauguration of our President, Barack Obama, is a very fitting day to also be celebrating Dr. King's birthday, as David mentioned earlier. But while it's fitting and indicative of advancement from Dr. King's time and because of Dr. King's actions, I believe Dr. King would say, even today, we have many more miles to go. We have many more miles to go. We're familiar with the causes Dr. King fought for and worked for and gave his life for. Equality for African Americans and other people suffering under the yoke of racism, working on behalf of the poor of all colors, helping working people, union people fighting for decent wages, and late in his young life, working against aggressive U.S. involvement in foreign countries when we shouldn't have been there in the first place. We're also familiar with his approach to solving these problems. Direct action, protest, but always using nonviolence. That clearly is something that he is famous and will always be famous for. He was not one to sit and rely on politicians and elected officials to achieve the solutions. We know that. He had conferences with many presidents and said, thank you for your offer, but we're still going to march. And that was what he believed. And despite the election of Barack Obama, even today, and I want to underline that even today, I think he would still retain the belief that people still need to gain greater reforms through organizing and, if necessary, protesting. I don't think he ever would have given that up, even with some of the reforms and changes, and even with the election of the first African-American president. Now, 44 years after Dr. King's death, social and economic inequality and injustice remain on the nation's agenda. Unfortunately, they persist. We see an ever-widening income gap between rich and poor. We see gaps in education achievement between different races. And we see violence across our nation, as we've heard discussed already, to name just a few of the ills. But I do want to talk about violence a little bit tonight. We've seen an uptick in mass violence. You know, we could go through each situation from Virginia Tech to a gunman walking into a movie theater to another gunman walking to a political rally, shooting people, a young child, and obviously seriously injuring a congresswoman. And then, obviously, more recently, the loss of 26 people, mostly children, in Newtown. All these and other similar events, and we don't have to go through that litany, are horrible and unimaginable. And they are clearly crimes against humanity. And they have to be stopped. There's no question about it. But so too should the individual acts of violence perpetrated in our urban areas, in Washington, in Baltimore, and in Prince George's County. It might not be 20 people at once, it might be one individual, like that young man in Fort Washington yesterday, but that's violence that shouldn't be taking place in our society. It's true that homicides have dropped in our county in the last 12 months. I think 35% in the last year or two, down to a low of, I think, in the last 35 years. And a lot of that is attributable to our county executive, Rashawn Baker, and police chief McGaw, and other people in the police department and community watch people like yourselves. So I think we see improvements, and that's terrific, and I think we're glad for that. But young people, primarily African American and Latino, are still dying by gun violence every year, every week in our county. It is absolutely true that the person pulling the trigger is a criminal and must be tracked down. But just as criminal are the people and the organizations that allow those illegal guns to enter our county and our communities. They're just as liable. There are 300 million guns in this country. 300 million guns. These guns are killing our youth. And while we would like to settle disputes nonviolently, you wouldn't have a drive-by shooting if all you had were your fists. We'd rather be done nonviolently, but if there weren't these guns, we wouldn't see this loss of life. The NRA doesn't want fewer guns. They want more guns, and more murderous ones at that. They're not defending the hunter anymore. They're fronting for the gun manufacturers, who want to put more guns on the street, make more money, and they're using the Second Amendment as cover. The Second Amendment, 230 years ago, protected your right to have a musket, a one-shot musket, in the late 1700s. Not to have a weapon of mass destruction that shoots 30 bullets before you can blink. But that's their excuse, that's their defense. Who other than the military or the police should have an AK-47 or a Bushmaster? In my mind, no one. You know, the NRA says that the way to stop bad men with guns is to arm good men with guns. That was their position. Their executive director, Wayne LaPierre, said the best way to address bad men with guns is get good men with guns. But let me juxtapose that with what Dr. King said. Dr. King said, and I quote, "The ultimate weakness of violence is that it is descending spiral, begetting the very thing it seeks to destroy. Instead of diminishing evil, it multiplies it. Through violence, you murder the hater, but you do not murder hate. Returning violence for violence multiplies violence, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. That's his approach. That's the approach I believe in. Hunters and people who simply want to protect their homes, they're not the ones clamoring for these weapons of mass destruction. They're not the ones. These weapons of mass destruction, cheap handguns, are everywhere, as we know. People sell them illegally to people who shouldn't have guns, and this needs to stop. It needs to stop. This session, along with the governor and my colleagues, we're going to try to pass legislation to control and track gun sales, limit the sale of semi-automatic weapons, and weapons with more than 10 cartridges. We all need to stand up to the NRA and say they have no business in our state. We have to pass reasonable gun laws, and we have to do it today. It may seem incongruous to talk about us abolishing the death penalty in the same breath you're talking about gun violence. Perpetrators of heinous crimes should be put behind bars for life. But the death penalty raises much broader issues. DNA can be used to convict the guilty, but also to exonerate those people who are not guilty, who are innocent. 18 people who've been convicted and have been on death row for over 200 years have had their cases reversed through DNA because they were the wrong individual. Yet if they would have been executed, there's no bringing them back. There have been 300 people for a multitude of crimes who have had post-conviction exonerations because there was a mistake. But science said they were the wrong person. A couple of years ago, the former Attorney General for the United States, Benjamin Civiletti, a Marylander, he led a task force to review how the death penalty was used in Maryland. And what they found was that killers of white victims were 2.5 times more likely to receive the death penalty than for murdering a black victim. Discrimination plays a factor, although not in the criminal, but in the victim. But it also relates to who you will send to the execution. I think it is high time, no, I should say it is past time, that we abolish the death penalty, and I hope we do it this session. Two other issues are before the legislature. There'll be a lot of issues, but two other issues I want to note are before the legislature this session, and one has been referred to, and I just want to very briefly mention it, and it was great to hear President Obama speak about it today. We need to replace polluting sources of energy with clean, sustainable energy. We need to produce electricity without polluting our air or our water. But it's not just because it cleans up the environment. It also will create jobs. It is time we moved into the 21st century and move away from those kind of energy sources that were developed in the 1800s and move to ones that we can use for the 21st and 22nd century that will allow our children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren to survive and grow and be successful. If we don't make changes now, we're going to have a serious, serious problem, and Hurricane Sandy and the storms are just the beginning. We have to do something about it. We need to slow down climate change, and one way to do it is with offshore wind. That means these big turbines, about 10 or 11 miles off the coast, that we can create energy, electricity for thousands and thousands of homes. And once they're built, the price doesn't change because the wind keeps coming. It's sustainable, and we have to move in that direction. It's clean and non-polluting and can stabilize costs, and hopefully this year we can pass that bill. And finally, one other issue, and that's about tax justice. We've raised the tax rate, although not nearly enough, on the very wealthiest millionaires and billionaires in our state and country, and it was done through the state legislature a couple of years ago. And this past year, President Obama was able to increase, although modestly, taxes on the very wealthy billionaires. Now we have to make sure that the very large businesses, the large corporations, making billions of dollars pay their fair share. Because right now in this state, probably 0.01% of the 70,000 businesses or 75,000 businesses pay no corporate income tax. These are the companies that can be in 50 states or in 50 countries. It's not like Three Brothers. It's not like your local laundromat. It's the big multinational companies. They have figured out ways to shift their money and revenue into subsidiaries in other states to get around the taxes. We're losing $100 million a year. We have to bring tax fairness, and while we don't know who they are, these companies, and there might be 10, 15, or 30 of them, we have to make them pay, and I again will introduce legislation to do just that. Now, let me close by returning to Dr. King for a very brief minute. As we all know, he was a nonviolent advocate for change. He gave his life advocating for that change, to bring justice and to give power to the powerless. That change is still needed. I think we have all agreed to that. Indeed, we still have many miles to go. With your help, with the help of grassroots groups working for social and economic justice, I and my colleagues that you heard from tonight will continue to give voice to those demands and fight for justice and equality here in Annapolis. We thank you for coming tonight. Thank you. Thank you.